For more than 20 years, the galaxy had been living in fear. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from rumors or distant threats. It was real, constant, and brutal. Entire star systems vanished overnight. Planets that once buzzed with life, music, markets, and laughter were reduced to silent, scorched rocks. And behind it all was the Cathar hegemony. No one knew exactly where they came from. Some said they emerged from the dark folds between galaxies. Others claimed they were once peaceful, but something twisted them. Maybe war, maybe hunger, maybe something worse. Whatever the truth, by the time the rest of the galaxy noticed them, it was already too late. The Cathar didn't negotiate. They didn't ask for surrender. They simply arrived, massive, jagged ships shaped like obsidian claws, blotting out the stars, and then they destroyed everything. Their weapons didn't just kill people. They melted cities into glass, poisoned oceans, and cracked planetary cores. Survivors? There were almost none. The few who escaped told stories of swarms of drone fighters that moved like a single mind, of warships that screamed as they fired, and of a silence that followed their attacks. A silence so deep it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. At first, the Galactic Concord tried to fight back. It was a loose alliance of dozens of species, some bird-like, some insectoid, some made of light or crystal, each with their own languages, cultures, and ways of life. But they had one thing in common. They wanted to live in peace. When the Cathar struck, the Concord sent fleets. Brave crews from 100 worlds charged into battle, shields blazing, voices raised in unity. But one by one, those fleets disappeared. Not defeated, erased, no wreckage, no distress calls. Just empty space where proud ships had once flown. After a while, the Concord stopped sending help. Not out of cowardice, but because they had nothing left to send. Their shipyards were rubble. Their command centers were ash. Their people were hiding in caves, tunnels, or drifting in broken freighters, hoping to stay off the Cathar's radar. Hope became a luxury no one could afford. By the year 2347, only a handful of frontier worlds remained untouched, and even those were just waiting. Like animals sensing a storm, everyone knew the Cathar would come for them too. It wasn't a question of if, but when. And when they came, there would be no rescue, no miracle, no last-minute cavalry from the stars. One of those last free worlds was Erebus Prime. It wasn't glamorous. No gleaming towers or floating gardens, just a cold, rocky planet orbiting a dim red star far from the main trade lanes. For centuries, it had been a mining colony, humans digging deep into the crust for rare minerals used in starship engines and medical tech. Over time, it became a refuge, not by design but by accident. When the war started, refugees from shattered colonies, some human, some not, ended up here because no one else would take them. They built shelters underground, recycled air and water, and lived quietly, trying not to draw attention. But silence doesn't always save you. Rumors reached Erebus first through static-filled comms from a dying freighter. Then came the long-range sensors, faint energy signatures moving fast, closing in. Within weeks, the sky darkened. Not with clouds, but with ships. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. The Cathar had found them. Panic spread like fire. Families packed what little they had. Engineers tried to jury-rig old defense turrets. Children were taught how to seal bulkheads and use emergency oxygen masks. There was no army, no fleet, not even a proper militia. Just miners, medics, teachers, and mechanics, ordinary people facing the end of everything. And yet, in the middle of all this fear, one man didn't run. He wasn't a hero, at least not anymore. Once, he'd worn the uniform of Earth's last real space navy. He'd commanded ships, led missions, even stood before the Concord Council. But that was years ago, after a disastrous battle near the Orion Veil, where his fleet was ambushed and nearly wiped out. He'd been blamed. Not officially, but everyone knew. He stepped down, disappeared, and ended up on Erebus working in the deep mines, keeping his head down. Now, with death hovering in orbit, he walked through the colony's central hub, listening to the whispers, watching the faces. He saw the same look he'd seen on 100 other worlds: resignation. The quiet acceptance that this was how it ended, but something in him refused to accept it. Late that night, while most of the colony slept fitfully or prayed in silence, he made his way to an old access tunnel marked decommissioned, hazardous. It hadn't been opened in over a decade. The door groaned as he forced it open, revealing a long, sloping shaft that led deep into the planet's crust. At the bottom, buried under layers of dust and forgotten orders, sat a ship. Not just any ship, it was massive, over a kilometer long, its hull scarred from past battles but still intact. Sleek, angular, built for one purpose, to fight and survive. Painted in faded gray with the old Earth defense insignia barely visible, it looked like a ghost from a better time. This was the UN's Retribution, the last dreadnought ever built by humanity. After the Navy was disbanded, it was supposed to be scrapped. But someone, maybe out of sentiment, maybe out of stubborn hope, had hidden it here instead. The man ran his hand along the cold metal of the airlock. He knew every system, every flaw, every trick this ship could pull. He'd trained on her, fought on her, nearly died on her. And now she was the only thing standing between Erebus and total annihilation. He didn't have a crew. Not really. But he knew people down here who still had fire in them. A young engineer who could fix a fusion core with duct tape and hope. A former medic who'd patched up soldiers in the outer colonies. A communications officer who could fake signals well enough to fool enemy scanners. They weren't soldiers, but they were willing. Over the next few days, in secret, they worked. Powering up dormant systems, recharging weapons, testing the shields. It wasn't pretty. Wires sparked, alarms blared, and more than once they thought the whole thing would collapse. But slowly, the Retribution woke up. Outside, the Cathar ships grew bolder. Drop pods circled the upper atmosphere. Scans swept the surface. The invasion was hours away. The man stood on the bridge looking out through the main viewport at the swarm of enemy vessels blotting out the stars. He felt no fear, only clarity. He keyed the comms, not to the colony, but to a narrow band channel that would reach every hidden receiver on Erebus. "We're not dying today," he said, voice calm but firm. "Not like this. They think we're weak because we're alone. But one ship, one crew, that's all it takes to remind them that fear works both ways." Below, in the tunnels, people heard his words. Some cried, some cheered. Most just held their loved ones a little tighter. Above, in orbit, the Cathar prepared to strike. They had no idea what was coming, because for the first time in 20 years, someone was about to fight back, not for glory, not for conquest, but simply because it was the right thing to do. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. Erebus Prime had always been quiet, too quiet for most people's liking. But in the days before the Cathar arrived, that silence became heavy like the air before a storm. Everyone moved slower, spoke softer, as if noise itself might draw the enemy's eye. Children stopped playing outside. Markets shut down. Even the wind through the canyon vents seemed to hold its breath. Deep below the surface, in the old mining tunnels, a different kind of energy buzzed. Not panic, something sharper, more focused. Hope, maybe, or desperation dressed up as courage. The Dreadnought sat in its hidden bay like a sleeping dragon. Rust clung to its outer hull and dust coated the control panels, but inside, lights flickered back to life one by one. Wires were spliced, coolant lines patched, and the main reactor hummed with a low, steady growl, the sound of a beast waking after a long hibernation. The man who'd found it didn't give orders like a general. He asked, "Can you get the comms array online? Think you can reroute power from the secondary battery? You ever fired a graviton cannon before?" Most of the answers were no, but that didn't stop anyone from trying. A teenage girl who'd grown up fixing ore haulers now crawled through maintenance shafts, rerouting fiber optics with steady hands. An older man who once taught astrophysics at a colony university now calibrated targeting sensors using nothing but a handheld scanner and memory. A former cargo pilot, grounded after an accident, volunteered to man the helm, even though the Retribution handled nothing like the freighters she knew. They weren't soldiers, but they were all they had. Word spread quietly through the colony. Someone's going up there, not to run, not to hide, to fight. At first, people didn't believe it. A single ship against the Cathar Armada. It sounded like a fairy tale or a suicide note. But then they saw the launch bay doors being cleared, heard the low thrum of engines testing, and something shifted. Maybe it wasn't about winning. Maybe it was just about refusing to go quietly. In the mess hall turned war room, the man gathered the volunteers. No grand speech, just truth. "We won't survive a head-on fight," he said, standing over a flickering star map. "They've got numbers, firepower, and they don't feel fear. But they also don't expect us to fight back at all. That's our edge. He pointed to a cluster of asteroids orbiting Erebus, a graveyard of ancient rock and ice dense enough to scatter sensor beams. We stay hidden until the last second. Hit hard, hit fast, then vanish. Make them chase ghosts. One of the engineers frowned. What if they just glass the planet anyway? Even if we distract them, they could still wipe us out from orbit. They could, the man admitted. But the Cathar don't just destroy. They conquer. They like to watch. They want fear. And fear needs witnesses. He looked around the room. If we show them we're not afraid, even for a moment, it changes the game. That night, families gathered in the lower levels. Parents held their kids close. Old friends shared rations and quiet jokes. No one said goodbye out loud, but everyone knew what was coming. Some wrote messages on scraps of metal or recorded voice logs just in case. Not for history, just so someone someday might know they existed. By dawn, the retribution was ready, not perfect. Far from it. The portside shield generator was running at 60%. The food synthesizer was broken. Half the crew had never worn a pressure suit. But the weapons charged. The engines responded. And the heart of the ship, the human heart, was beating strong. As the final checks finished, the colony's main sensors blared an alert. Cathar drop pods had entered the upper atmosphere, landing in less than 2 hours. No more time, the man said. He climbed into the command chair on the bridge. It creaked under his weight, familiar and strange at once. Around him, his makeshift crew took their stations, hands trembling but steady, eyes wide but focused. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Deep in the planet's crust, massive doors groaned open, revealing a vertical shaft that led straight to the sky. Cold starlight poured in. The Retribution's engines flared to life, blue fire licking the tunnel walls. With a shudder that shook the entire colony, the Dreadnought lifted off. Below, people rushed to viewports or climbed to surface observation decks, hearts pounding. They watched as the great ship rose, slow at first, then faster until it punched through the thin atmosphere and vanished into the black. Silence returned to Erebus. But this time it wasn't the silence of waiting. It was the silence of holding your breath. In orbit, the Cathar fleet hung like a swarm of metal locusts. Their command vessel, a monstrous thing bristling with weapons and pulsing with eerie red light, hovered at the center. Smaller ships darted around it like angry insects. They were so sure of their victory, they hadn't even bothered with full battle formation. Why would they? Erebus had no defenses, no allies. No chance. They never saw the retribution coming. It emerged from the asteroid field like a shadow given teeth. One moment, empty space. The next, missiles streaking out silent and fast. The first explosion lit up the void. A Cathar drone carrier ripped apart, its swarm of fighters scattering like startled birds. Alarms blared across the enemy fleet. Confusion rippled through their ranks. This wasn't in their data. Humans didn't fight back. Not like this. The Dreadnought didn't stop. It banked hard, firing its main cannons, a deep, resonant boom that vibrated through space itself. Energy beams, bright as lightning, lanced out and struck the command vessel's forward spire. Not enough to destroy it, but enough to crack its armor and blind its primary sensors. For the first time in decades, the Cathar hesitated. On the bridge of the Retribution, the crew barely had time to cheer. "Shields at 78%, someone called. "They're turning to face us," shouted another. "Good," the man at the helm said. "Let them look." He didn't try to win the battle. He just needed to buy time. Every second the Cathar spent chasing them was a second Erebus wasn't being bombarded. Every shot they fired was a message. We're still here. The Dreadnought dove back into the asteroid field, weaving through jagged rocks and ice clouds. Cathar fighters gave chase, but they were built for open space, not tight, chaotic terrain. One clipped an asteroid and exploded. Another misjudged a turn and spun wildly into the dark. Back on Erebus, people watched the sky through cracked viewports and jury-rigged scanners. They saw flashes of light, heard distorted comms chatter, and for the first time in years they felt something unfamiliar. Pride. Not because they were safe, far from it, but because someone had stood up. Someone had said no, and in that moment the galaxy felt a little less dark. The Retribution wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a spark. And sparks, even small ones, can start fires that burn brighter than anyone expects. As the Dreadnought disappeared behind a moonlet, engines flaring for another run, The man allowed himself one small smile. They were still alive. Erebus was still standing. And the Cathar? For the first time they looked uncertain. That was enough. For now. The moment the Retribution fired its first shot, something changed. Not just in orbit, but across the whole galaxy. It wasn't just about destroying enemy ships. It was about breaking a spell. For over 20 years, the Cathar had ruled through fear, and fear only works when no one dares to challenge it. But now someone had news traveled faster than anyone expected. A smuggler's freighter hiding near the Helios drift picked up the battle chatter on a scrambled frequency. At first they thought it was a glitch. Humans hadn't fought back in years. But then they heard it again. The unmistakable roar of human weapons, the calm voice giving orders, the sharp crackle of explosions in the void. They recorded it, cleaned it up, and sent it out on every open channel they could find. Within hours, the message reached a refugee camp on a frozen moon. A mechanic who'd once flown scout ships played it over and over, tears freezing on his cheeks. On a derelict space station drifting near the ruins of Cygnus 9, a group of former Concord officers listened in stunned silence, then started checking their old weapon caches. Even in occupied systems where Cathar patrols watched every move, people found ways to share the recording. Whispered in alleyways, hidden in data chips disguised as ration wrappers, sung in lullabies with coded words the Cathar didn't understand. To them, resistance was illogical. Their empire ran on control, on predictability. They expected surrender, not defiance. And this lone ship, this battered, outdated human dreadnought, was doing the impossible, making them look weak. Back in orbit around Erebus, the battle raged. The Retribution wasn't winning, not in the way wars are usually won. It was losing hull plating, burning through power reserves and running low on coolant, but it kept moving, kept fighting. Every time the Cathar thought they had it cornered, the Dreadnought would vanish into an asteroid field, loop behind a moon, or use the planet's magnetic field to mask its signature. It wasn't just flying, it was dancing, and the Cathar, for all their power, couldn't keep up. Inside the ship, exhaustion was setting in. The crew hadn't slept in over 30 hours. Meals were skipped. Injuries were patched with med gel and gritted teeth. One young engineer passed out from blood loss after a console exploded, but was back on her feet an hour later, helping reroute power with one arm in a sling. No one complained. No one asked to quit. They knew what was at stake. The man in command didn't give pep talks. He didn't need to. He just kept making decisions, fast, clear, and calm. When a Cathar cruiser tried to flank them, he ordered a micro-jump that nearly tore the ship apart, but put them right behind the enemy's blind spot. When their main targeting system failed, he used old-school manual calculations, calling out coordinates like he was reading a map from memory. He wasn't a hero. He was just someone who refused to let fear decide the future, and it worked. One by one, Cathar ships began to pull back, not because they were defeated, but because they were confused. Their hive-mind coordination, usually flawless, started to glitch. Too many unexpected variables, too much chaos. For the first time, they weren't hunting prey. They were being hunted. Down on Erebus, people watched the sky and dared to hope. The drop pods that had been descending, they'd stopped. The bombardment that everyone expected never came. Instead, the Cathar fleet was turning inward, scanning for threats, repositioning defensively. The invasion had stalled. In the colony's main shelter, a child asked, "Are we safe now?" An older woman, her hands still shaking from days of fear, looked up at the ceiling, as if she could see through rock and sky to the battle above. "Not safe," she said softly, "but we've got a chance, and that's more than we had yesterday." That night, something remarkable happened. Across the outer rim, small acts of rebellion began to bloom. On a mining world under Cathar control, workers sabotaged a fuel depot. On a communications relay station, a technician rerouted enemy signals into a loop, causing hours of confusion. A group of smugglers ambushed a supply convoy near the Helios drift. Not for profit, but just to prove they could. None of these groups knew each other. They didn't have a plan, but they all had one thing in common. They'd heard about the lone dreadnought. They'd heard that someone somewhere had said, "Enough." Back on the Retribution, the crew finally got a moment to breathe. "Just a few minutes." They floated in the dim light of the mess deck, sipping warm broth from dented mugs, staring at the stars through a cracked viewport. No one spoke for a long time. Then someone said, "Do you think they'll remember us?" The man leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "They won't remember the ship," he said. "They'll remember what it stood for. That's what matters." He was right. Already the story was changing. In some places they called it the ghost ship. In others, the last light. But everywhere it meant the same thing. Resistance was possible. The Cathar, meanwhile, were scrambling. Their command structure, once seamless, was showing cracks. Smaller fleets began acting independently, some even retreating without orders. Rumors spread among their ranks, or what passed for ranks in a hive mind, that the humans had developed a new weapon, a virus, a secret alliance. None of it was true, but fear doesn't care about truth. It only cares about doubt. And doubt was spreading. The retribution wasn't just fighting a battle. It was planting seeds, seeds of courage, of unity, of the simple idea that no one is too small to make a difference. As the ship drifted in the shadow of Erebus's largest moon, engines cooling, weapons recharging, the crew looked at each other, not as strangers thrown together by fate, but as something more. A family, a promise, a beginning. They knew the fight wasn't over. The Cathar would regroup. They'd come back stronger, angrier. But now they wouldn't be facing silence. They'd be facing a galaxy that remembered how to fight. And it all started with one ship, one crew, one choice. Up there in the endless dark, the retribution wasn't just surviving. It was lighting a fire, and fires once lit are hard to put out. The message didn't just spread, it exploded. Like a single spark dropped into dry grass, it raced across the galaxy, carried not by governments or fleets, but by ordinary people who'd had enough. A smuggler's ship broadcasting the battle logs on loop. A refugee child humming the Dreadnought's call sign like a lullaby. A mechanic on a backwater moon carving the ship's silhouette into a rusted hull plate and hanging it over his workshop door. It wasn't propaganda. It was proof. Someone had stood up and the monsters flinched. On worlds long thought lost, something stirred. In the slums beneath the glassed cities of Viridia, workers who'd spent years bowing their heads began leaving coded symbols on walls. Simple circles with a slash through them, the old Earth symbol for resist. Patrol drones scanned them but couldn't understand. To the Cathar, it was just graffiti. To the people, it was a heartbeat. In the Helios drift, a ragtag group of freighter captains, most of them retired, some barely spaceworthy, formed what they jokingly called the Ghost Fleet. They had no weapons to speak of, just old cargo lasers and jury-rigged EMP bursts, but they knew the shipping lanes better than anyone. When a Cathar supply convoy passed through a narrow corridor near the gas giant Lyra 9, the Ghost Fleet struck. Not to destroy, just to delay. They jammed comms, scattered sensor buoys, and led the convoy into a magnetic storm. The Cathar lost 3 transports and hours of precious time. It wasn't much, but it was something, and something was becoming a movement. Back near Erebus, the retribution was running on fumes, hull breaches patched with emergency foam, food synthesizers down to nutrient paste. Half the crew moved like ghosts themselves, pale, exhausted, eyes red from lack of sleep. But they kept flying, kept fighting. Every time the Cathar tried to regroup, the Dreadnought would appear like a shadow, fire a volley and vanish again. It wasn't winning battles, it was winning time. And time was the one thing the galaxy hadn't had in decades. The man in command knew they couldn't keep this up forever. The ship was breaking. The crew was breaking. But he also knew something else. They'd already done more than anyone expected. They'd given people back their voice. One evening, as the retribution drifted in the cold silence between asteroids, a faint signal came through. A tight beam transmission, encrypted but not heavily. It was from a former conquered admiral, hiding on a dead moon with a handful of loyal officers. The message was short. "We're rallying at Cygnus 9. If you can draw them away from the rim for another 48 hours, we might have a chance to strike their rear supply lines." The man didn't hesitate. He turned to his crew. "We've got one more run in us," he said. "Let's make it count." They didn't cheer. They just nodded. That was enough. Meanwhile, down on Erebus, life had changed. People weren't just waiting to die anymore. They were preparing to live. Engineers built signal boosters from scrap metal. Teachers taught kids how to read star charts and send coded messages. Even the youngest children learned how to seal airlocks and identify enemy ship signatures. It wasn't about war, it was about dignity, about refusing to be erased without a trace, and then came the broadcast. It wasn't planned. It just happened. The man standing on the bridge of the battered Dreadnought opened a wide frequency channel, not just to Erebus, but to anyone listening across known space. His voice was tired but steady. "They think we're broken," he said. "They think fear is enough to keep us quiet. But we remember. We remember how to bleed, and how to make them bleed harder." He didn't say join us, he didn't say fight, he just reminded them that they were still human, still alive, still capable of choice. The message looped for hours. Ships picked it up. Stations rebroadcast it. On occupied worlds, people played it through hidden speakers in alleyways, just loud enough for neighbors to hear before shutting it off. Some wept, some smiled. Most just stood a little taller that day. The Cathar didn't understand. Their intelligence networks scrambled to trace the signal, to locate the source, to crush it. But the message wasn't in one place, it was everywhere, and you can't bomb an idea. Their response was swift and brutal. Entire patrols were pulled from occupied zones and redirected toward Erebus. The Grand Armada began to shift, turning its full attention to the one ship that dared defy it. It was exactly what the man had hoped for. Every Cathar vessel that chased the Retribution was one less vessel terrorizing a colony, one less gun pointed at a child's home. In the outer systems, liberated crews took advantage of the distraction. A former mining drone, reprogrammed with scavenged weapons, ambushed a Cathar scout near the Ophian Belt. A group of medics on a refugee barge used emergency flares to mimic a distress call, luring a patrol ship into an asteroid trap set by local pilots. These weren't grand battles. They were pinpricks. But pinpricks add up, and for the first time the Cathar were bleeding. Not just in ships or supplies, but in certainty. Their perfect machine was starting to rattle. Orders came slower. Responses grew erratic. Rumors even spread among their lower-tier drone pilots, those few who still had independent thought, that the humans had allies, ancient powers, hidden fleets, weapons from the void. None of it was true, but belief is powerful, especially when you've spent your whole life thinking you're invincible. On the Retribution, the crew felt it too, the shift in the wind. The Cathar weren't just angry anymore. They were afraid. And fear makes mistakes. One night, during a brief lull, a young crew member asked, "Do you think we'll win?" The man looked out at the stars, cold, endless, beautiful. "Winning isn't about destroying them," he said. "It's about making sure they never forget. We were here. We fought. And we didn't bow. That was the real victory. Not territory. Not trophies. Just memory." As the Dreadnought powered up for its next run, the crew moved with quiet purpose. No grand speeches. No dramatic music. Just people doing what needed to be done because no one else would. And somewhere, in 1,000 hidden corners of the galaxy, others were doing the same. The Cathar had spent 20 years teaching the galaxy to fear them. Now, the galaxy was learning something new: how to hope. The end didn't come with a bang at first. It came with silence, the kind of silence that follows a storm, when the wind stops and the world holds its breath. The Retribution drifted in the cold dark near the nebula of shattered stars, its hull scarred, its lights dim, its crew running on nothing but willpower and the last dregs of oxygen. They'd done all they could, drawn the Cathar Grand Armada away from a dozen vulnerable worlds, given rebels time to strike, lit a fire that couldn't be put out. But now, they were out of tricks. Out of time. The Cathar had finally cornered them, not with a single ship but with the full might of their armada. Hundreds of vessels, black as nightmares, surrounding the Dreadnought like wolves closing in on wounded prey. There was no escape this time. No asteroid field to hide in, no moon to duck behind. Just open space and the enemy. But the man on the bridge didn't look defeated. He looked focused, because he'd known this moment would come. And he'd planned for it, not to survive but to finish what they'd started. He turned to his crew, not as a captain giving orders, but as one of them. "We've got one shot," he said. "And it's not pretty. But it'll work." They didn't ask questions. They just nodded. They'd followed him this far. They'd go all the way. The plan was simple, brutal, and brilliant. Deep inside the nebula lay the remains of a dead star, A neutron star spinning fast, its gravity so strong it bent light itself. Most ships avoided it. Too dangerous. Too unpredictable. But the Retribution wasn't most ships. And its crew wasn't most crews. They fired up the engines, what was left of them, and flew straight toward the heart of the nebula. The Cathar followed, confident, arrogant, certain this was the end. They didn't understand sacrifice. They only understood control. As the Dreadnought neared the neutron star, alarms blared. Hull stress warnings flashed red. The ship groaned like a living thing in pain, but they kept going. Deeper, closer. Then, at the last possible second, the man gave the order. Dump the core. It wasn't just an explosion. It was a controlled collapse. The Retribution's main reactor, already unstable, was triggered to overload and fire its entire energy output directly into the neutron star's magnetic field. The result wasn't fire or shrapnel. It was something far stranger. A pulse of warped gravity. A ripple in space-time itself. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, everything did. The pulse shot outward like a stone dropped in a cosmic pond. It didn't destroy ships. It unmade their coordination. Cathar vessels, linked by a hive mind network that relied on precise quantum signals, suddenly went blind. Their shared consciousness fractured. Orders vanished. Sensors scrambled. Drones spun out of control. Command ships lost contact with their wings. In that one moment of chaos, the perfect machine broke. Half the Cathar fleet drifted, confused, directionless. The other half panicked, firing at shadows, colliding with each other in the dark. The Grand Armada, the terror of the galaxy, was reduced to a cloud of lost, frightened insects. And the Retribution? It was gone. Swallowed by the pulse, by the star, by the silence that followed. But its work was done. News of the Armada's collapse spread like wildfire. Rebel cells that had been hiding for years saw their chance. The Ghost Fleet struck supply lines with new confidence. The conquered remnants launched a full counteroffensive from Cygnus 9. Even neutral systems, who'd stayed out of the war, now sent ships, not out of duty, but because they finally believed victory was possible. Within weeks, the Cathar were retreating. Not in an orderly fashion, but in disarray. Their empire, built on fear and flawless control, couldn't survive without it. One by one, occupied worlds rose up, not with massive armies, but with wrenches, hacked comms, and the courage to say no one more time. A year later, representatives from over 50 species gathered on a rebuilt platform orbiting Erebus Prime. They weren't there to celebrate a battle. They were there to sign something new, the new Concord. A promise not just to defend each other, but to remember why they fought. And at the center of the chamber, floating in a clear case, was a single piece of metal. Twisted, scorched, barely recognizable. A fragment of the Retribution's hull recovered by scavengers near the nebula. No one knew if anyone had survived the final jump. Most believed they hadn't, but it didn't matter. What mattered was what they'd given the galaxy. A second chance. From that day on, every ship that launched from a free port carried a small plaque near its helm. No fancy words, just 2 lines. Remember Erebus. Remember the One. Kids in schools learned about the Dreadnought not as a weapon, but as a symbol of how one act of courage can echo across stars. Artists painted it in murals. Poets wrote verses about its last flight. And on quiet nights, when people looked up at the sky, they didn't just see stars. They saw possibility. Because the truth was, the Cathar hadn't been defeated by firepower or technology. They'd been undone by something far more powerful. The refusal of ordinary people to accept that the story was over. The man and his crew hadn't saved the galaxy by winning a war. They'd saved it by reminding everyone that they still had a voice, and that sometimes, all it takes is one voice to start a chorus. Years later, an old engineer on Erebus would tell visitors how, on the day the Retribution launched, the whole colony stood in silence, watching the sky. We didn't know if we'd ever see it again, he'd say, voice rough with memory. But we knew right then that even if we died, we'd die standing. And that made all the difference. That's the thing about hope. It doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to exist, even in the darkest corner of space on a broken ship, with a handful of tired souls who chose to fight when no one else would. And from that tiny spark, a whole new future was born.